Hello and welcome to our next session of intercultural communication. I am Parvez Khan, Assistant Professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Cohort University of Science and Technology. The course code is GMC 201. It's our lecture, Stages of Culture Shock. So, before starting our session, we'll be talking about the objectives of this session. Basically, students will be able to understand the impact of culture on individuals. Students will be able to understand the dynamics of a culture shock and how it contributes to our intercultural competence. And moreover, the students will be able to build a wider perspective for adjustment in different cultural settings. So, the purpose of this session is to talk about culture shock. We've already talked about it briefly about it, but today I'm going to make a video because this is an important lesson that you need to have it with yourselves and think about it more. Because when you go to a foreign culture outside your own, you need to know these understandings that this will happen, and it will give you a better understanding of why such things need to be discussed and why it will help you as an individual to get adjusted in a setting outside your own. So, what is it about? Like, what is this culture shock about? Why is it important to talk about it? So, what is basically culture shock? It's basically us versus them. Do we have to talk about who are we in relationship to others? How do we see ourselves when we compare ourselves to others? And then we have to think about a requirement. Is it a requirement for a more globalized world? Do we need it? Is it helpful? Will this understanding of cultural settings give us a better adjustment plans in future? And is it about exploring our own identities? Because when you know yourself in relationship to others, you have a better understanding of your own self. So, is it helpful in that context? Moreover, it's about tolerance and peace. So, is it a requirement for a more globalized world that we're living in? So that's what we have to look into as a culture shock discussion on a culture shock, and this is what we have to look into. So you can see that culture shock is there when you are belonging to one ethnic tribe, or one ethnic identity, or one race, and when you go out somewhere else, obviously the difference would be there, and expecting those people to react to you in accordance to that. But you have to be prepared that this will happen. For example, you've lived all your life in a village and you've never seen a car, or you've never seen something different, and when you come out to cities, you look at it from a different perspective. Similarly, when you go outside your own country, people, the way they dress, the way they eat, the way they interact may be completely different. You may never have seen intermixing of genders in villages, but over there, maybe there's no concept of gender bias. So, with time, when you go outside your own culture, when you go outside your own settings, there will be issues that will be coming. The purpose of this session is to prepare you for a culture shock. And obviously, when you go out, when you see people, you see different hairstyles, colors, dresses, it'll give you an idea. Maybe you have a bias, maybe you think differently, but when you spend some time, it'll be there. But what is a culture shock? We have to talk about that. So, culture shock, which is first identified by anthropologist Calvero Oberg, is a long term psychological stress that human beings experience when they move to a completely new culture. Basically, the term refers to psychological stress, it's basically mental stress. And it can be like you've never seen it before, you feel like anxiety. But obviously, there are stages to that as well. Yeah, we'll talk about it. But culture shock, like a disease, has causes, symptoms, and cures. And basically, what it does, it refers to the traumatic experience that an individual may encounter when they enter a culture different from their own. It's basically a traumatic experience as well. I don't look at this because there's a good phase to it as well. There's a honeymoon stage in this beginning, but obviously, culture shock refers to certain. It refers to anxieties as well. So, culture shock is about the stress and the feeling of disorientation you experience in a new culture. And for example, if you are temporarily visiting a new culture. For example, you've never seen monks in your life, and you go to Nepal or you go to some Buddhist country, and you see them how they're worshipping, how they're spending their lives, how they're avoiding meat and they're living on vegetable. That may be a culture shock to you. For example, in Pakistan, when you go out and you visit Kailash, you will find out completely different culture, how exciting it can be. You'll be feeling differently, that there is some difference. So culture shock, mainly the one I'm talking about, it may be in a foreign land because you are outside your own settings, and that may give you a feeling of disorientation and a bit of stress. So basically, he coined the term, Oberg coined the term like 5 decades ago, and he believed that culture shocks produce an identity disorientation state. And what does he mean by this? Is that it may be a sense of identity loss. I've highlighted this. It may be a sense of identity loss and identity deprivation with regard to values, status, profession, friends. For example, you have lived all your life with friends and suddenly you go to a country where you're all alone. Even that can be a cultural shock, and it can cause you identity issues as well, because you know you've been very comfortable in your place. You know that you are a Sindhi from Pakistan, all your friends are Sindhi, but suddenly you go to a country where you're living with Jamaicans or you're living with Canadians. You just can't relate to it suddenly, and that can cause a feeling of disorientation. Now, what I'm talking about is the identity strain, which can be as a result required to make necessary psychological adaptation. And sometimes what happens is that there's identity rejection by the members of new cultures, and sometimes you are not accepted. Sometimes it takes time for you to get adjusted. Sometimes you may face racism. Sometimes you may face chronic issues, but it's all part of cultural shock. It happens, it's very natural. Now, identity confusion, especially regarding role and ambiguity and unpredictability. Now, these three words will be there. You're confused. What are you doing there? People over there are eating different food. Is there halal food available? How I'm going to interact with them? Their religion is different. How am I going to get adjusted? How they're going to respond to me? And how can I understand them? That's going to cause a lot of confusion. And then identity powerlessness as a result of not being able to cope with the new environment. For example, you go to a classroom as a student and all your students are white. They're speaking in a very good English, and you have been from a very rural background, and when you suddenly reach there, it will take you some time to get adjusted. So, my point here is that you don't have to worry. You don't have to be. You shouldn't be stressed about it because it's natural. And only people who've traveled more, who've walked more, who've talked to the individual, they can understand that it's a natural phase. It happens to everyone, particularly from those going outside their own comfort zones, from their own comfortable places, from their own known environment. So that's why it happens, because you're no more comfortable. You've been moved, you've been changed. So even at later stages, people who migrate to different countries, they may take some time to get adjusted in this regard. Now, it can cause a bit of anxiety, it can cause stress, but let's now discuss the term ABCs of cultural shock. Now, let's talk how it can work, how it affects you. So, my next slide is that that ABCs word it all. They basically discuss the ABCs of cultural shock in terms of affective, behavioral, and cognitive disorientation. Now, the point is that it's cognitive, it can be mental, because basically we need to look into cultural shock in terms of psychological perspective. So, what does it cause? It causes anxiety. Anxiety means that you are stressful, it's giving you stress, you are worried. It can give you a sense of bewilderment. You're not sure what's happening, which leads to further confusion, and you're not sure what's going on around you. You're not even aware of what's happening around you. So, all these points they combine together and they lead towards disorientation and perplexity. You are not sure, you're uncertain, you're just disoriented. So all these words basically different meaning, but they all mean the same. Now, the key is that you have to look into the norms. What are the particular norms of that place? How people are living? What are the conditions? How they are responding? What have been the cultural practices? What have been their traditions? So you need to look into that to need to get adjusted. And then there are certain rules. Obviously, even if you join any institution, for example, university, there are certain rules that you need to have an ID card. People who have been living in studying in colleges, when they come to university, certain rules they find different. So when you go to a country which is outside your comfort zone, it's a new country. Obviously, you need to understand the rules. That what are their basic rules? How is the law and order? How what do people find offensive? So a good study of that will give you a better idea of how to get adjusted in a setting outside your own. And then a great tip would be to initiate uh, um conversations. Now, if you initiate conversations, if you drop a hello, maybe people get offended, but maybe you get an idea of how these people are. Now, the problem with Pakistani community living outside is that they always try to live together and they stop interacting with people where they're studying. So, most of the people, when they go to countries like China or Korea, they hardly learn their language, they hardly learn their customs, they hardly know about their food recipes. Now, it is mainly because you haven't interacted with them, you haven't talked to them. The more you talk to them, the more you interact with them, you'll have better ideas of how this thing goes. So basically, all these things are important to consider. All these things have a certain way of getting adjusted and reducing a culture shock. Now, basically, I'm not focusing much on the definition of culture shock. We've already talked about it, that when you go out there, you're surprised to see, for example, you have never seen a flying car and you go outside and you see a Tesla car flying outside. That may be a culture shock for you. But today we are focusing on the stages and how you can cope and deal with it. So, one way is to follow norms, the other way is to follow rules. The third way I'm talking about is to conversate, to start conversations with people, to initiate conversations, to start talking to people. But along with that, you'll also have to see and understand the non-verbal conversations, how people interact, what are their gestures, how they respond, do they smile often? Because one common thing in many Western countries, when you go for a walk, for a stroll, for a jog, people, when they look at you, they pass a smile, and that's pleasant. You smile back. Now, in some countries, you may not find the same. People may be quite serious. So you have to look into the non-verbal perspective as well, how people respond to the non-verbal session as well. So culture shock basically, there's a feeling of disorientation, but you can counter it with norms, rules, initiating conversations, and looking into nonverbals. So, what happens is that cognitive, why is culture shock there? Because cognitively, people lack interpretive competence to explain many of the bizarre behaviors that are occurring in their unfamiliar culture. People see, maybe you see people skating around you, passing so quickly, you may find that offensive, but that's normal in some cultures. In some cultures, they avoid physical touch, they avoid coming closer, while in other cultures, people come close, they speak loudly. So you have to see into all of these things before building your competence about a particular culture. So my question would be that from students, that what experiences did you have outside your own settings? Have you all ever been outside Peshawar, Kohat? Have you ever been to places which were very, very surprising? So I want you to think more about it. That is there any particular place, space that where you went, you felt different, you never seen? For example, even a small visit to a shrine or a temple can be a different experiences, can bring along different experiences. Or, for example, attending a wedding of from minority communities, that can be different, which you've never experienced before. So as a student, you have to look into the experiences because you have to build upon those experiences, share it, and go on. And then my question would be, did you ever face a culture shock? Maybe did you ever observe something surprising, something different? And what was it? And how did it make you feel? Like, what was the difference? What were you feeling? Was it a good feeling, or were you feeling disoriented, or have you been outside Pakistan? Have you been to a holy pilgrimage somewhere? So all these experiences you have to see. Basically, the culture shock perspective is important to look into, but obviously it's important to talk about it. And then these are some of the pictures that I'm sharing with you. These are some of the pictures from the Pakistan's different spaces. A little girl from Kailash, and then there's some Sikh community. They are celebrating their event, and then some dances, cultural dances. So these are some of the things that you can look into as from cultural perspective. Before I end my session, we'll talk about dealing with culture shock. Important points that basically will help you with understanding that how we can deal with a culture shock. The first point is to realize that adjusting takes time. Importantly, it's very important that we focus that adjustment doesn't take place immediately. It will take time. The more you rush, the more anxiety it will cause. Many people, that's why, return very quickly, despite having a broader understanding. So, the more time you take, the better chances are that you'll deal with cultural shocks in a better way. And another way is to focus on the positives to see why you are there abroad, what are the prospects, what economic advantage or what educational advantage you're having here. So the more you focus on the positive, you'll have better chances to avoid the negativity that's taking you or the fears that are taking you over. So in this way, you're going to counter the culture shock. And along with this, you must focus on understanding your academic expectations. That why, what is your goal, particularly if you're a student. Many students they return after going through anxieties, but if you focus on a bigger goal, that why you're here, what nuisance value this degree will give you, how it will help you in your career. So that's what, when you look into the bigger picture, maybe that also helps you in countering this cultural shock. And along with this, um, um, accept that you will be homesick. Now, this acceptance is the key because if you're aware that there will be a stage where it's hard to adjust, you're missing your family members, you're missing your brothers and sisters or mothers and fathers. Obviously, it's very natural. We human beings have, if we are human beings, we are bound to live in families and we have our connection, sentimental, emotional attachments. That cannot be denied. So when you keep that in mind, and if you have traveled around the world, that's going to be natural. You're going to feel upset, you're going to miss your family, but you have to accept that you are going to be homesick. So once that acceptance comes, you basically are in a position to tackle the entire issue bravely. So then do not compare yourself to others because circumstances are different for each individual. Some people have different family backgrounds, some people have different economic circumstances, some have different job opportunities. So if you start comparing yourself with them, that's going to be a problem. So look into the entire scenario from your own perspective. That's why it's key. That's the key in dealing with the cultural shock. And get to know a variety of students, individuals, or people. I've written students, but because as a student, if you're going out, but meet individuals, start initiating conversations, get to know a variety of people, get to know their socialization, places of socialization. That's going to help you counter the culture shock. And then obviously find ways to relieve stress. And the key to that is by keeping an open mind. When you have an open mind, the acceptance comes with itself. So This is pretty much it, but let me conclude that culture shock is natural. It causes a lot of psychological stress. Particularly, we have discussed in details the four stages: the honeymoon stage, the frustration stage, and I'm talking about a frustration stage that when people start getting worried how things will go, how it will end, how it's going to be, how we are going to tackle the entire situation. And this class was particularly in addressing your anxieties, your stress. So understand that cultural shock is going to be natural. The stress is going to be natural. You're missing the family and your home country is going to be natural. So when you accept that, automatically a lot of issues are going to be solved. So I hope that you enjoyed the session. Basically, we focused on the anxieties that come along with culture shock. So this was our session. We've discussed the stages of culture shock, but this was in connection to that. So I've extended the lecture today. So I hope that you enjoyed the session. We'll be in touch. Once again, thank you very much for being here. We'll be in contact soon.